She was 42 years old, exhausted, and barely keeping her family's land alive. He was 24, young enough to be her son's best friend, old enough to know exactly what he felt. And the moment Colt Brennan took that axe from Eleanor Whitlock's trembling hands, everything between them changed forever. What happened next tore apart a lifelong friendship, split a community in two, and forced a grieving widow to choose between the life she was supposed to live and the one she actually wanted. If that kind of love story speaks to you, stay with me until the very end. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and don't forget to like so more people find it. The axe was too heavy for her, not because Eleanor Whitlock was a weak woman, she was anything but because she had been swinging it since before sunrise and her shoulders were done. The woodpile hadn't gotten any smaller. The morning hadn't gotten any warmer. And the thin skin across her palms was rubbed raw in a way that stung every time she repositioned her grip. She didn't stop. That was the thing about Eleanor that people in Harlan Creek either admired or found exhausting depending on their mood. She didn't stop. Hadn't stopped in 4 years, not since Samuel went into the ground on a gray November afternoon with half the settlement standing in the cold, hats in hand, watching the soil cover the only man she had ever loved. After that, stopping wasn't something she could afford. There were cattle to feed, fences to patch, a son to raise the rest of the way, and a ranch that didn't care one bit whether she was grieving or not. So she kept swinging, and she didn't ask for help. She never asked for help. Colt Brennan spotted her from the ridge trail, maybe 60 yards out. He'd been cutting across the Whitlock property the way he always did on his way back from the eastern pasture. A shortcut he'd used since he was 12 years old, back when Samuel Whitlock himself had told him the path was his to use any time he pleased. That had been 12 years ago. The permission felt permanent even now, embedded in the land the same way old fence posts were. He almost kept walking. He had things to do. His own bunk was cold. His coffee had been sitting since 4 in the morning, and he'd promised the foreman at the Harper spread he'd be back before noon. He had reasons to keep his boots moving. Instead, he stopped and watched her for a long moment. Eleanor raised the axe, brought it down, missed the center of the log, caught the edge, and the wood spun off the splitting stump and landed in the mud. She swore under her breath, just a single quiet word she probably didn't even know she'd said. Then bent down, picked the log up, set it back, and tried again. Something settled in Colt's chest that he didn't have a name for. Or maybe he had a name for it and just didn't want to use it. He came down off the ridge. She didn't hear him until he was close, maybe 10 feet away, because the wind was blowing toward the tree line and the axe was loud. When she finally turned and saw him standing there with his coat collar up and his hat pulled low against the cold, she startled. Just a small flinch, quickly controlled. Colt. She straightened up. Not defensive exactly, but not comfortable either. The way a person looks when they've been caught doing something they didn't want witnessed. "Morning, Mrs. Whitlock." She hated when he called her that. He knew it too. She'd told him 3 times over the past year to call her Eleanor like he had when he was younger, but every time he remembered to, something stopped him. Some line he kept drawing and redrawing in his head. "You're heading to the Harper place?" she asked, already turning back to the stump. "Was." She set another log. "Don't let me slow you down." He looked at her hands. Just for a second, just a glance she didn't catch. The knuckles were white from the cold and the grip, and there was a dark smear across her right palm that might have been dirt or might have been blood. He didn't look long enough to be sure. "Let me take a few turns," he said. "I'm fine." "I know you are." He said it like he meant it, because he did. "Doesn't mean I can't help." She glanced back at him over her shoulder. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. Not quite gratitude, not quite annoyance. Somewhere between the two, maybe. The expression of a woman who'd been told her whole life that needing help was the same as failing, and had believed it long enough that the belief had calcified into something she couldn't always see past. "Gideon should be back from town by midday," she said. "He'll finish it." "Midday's a long time from now." She didn't argue with that, because it was true. She reset her grip on the handle. "Eleanor." He hadn't planned to drop the formality, but there it was. Her name, just sitting there between them in the cold air. She stopped. "Give me the axe," he said. Drink some water. You've been out here since before light. I could see the smoke from the chimney when I left this morning." That wasn't quite true. He couldn't see her chimney from his bunkhouse, but she didn't call him on it. For a moment she just stood there, and Colt thought she was going to refuse him. She was perfectly capable of it. He'd watched her turn down offers of help from men twice his age, from neighbors who'd known her 20 years, from women at the settlement church who'd shown up with food and good intentions after Samuel died. Eleanor Whitlock had a talent for gracious refusal that left the other person feeling like they'd been the one doing her a favor by backing off. But something was different this morning. Maybe she was more tired than usual. Maybe the cold had gotten further into her bones than she'd admitted to herself. Maybe it was something else entirely. She held out the axe. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch. He made sure of that. She stepped back and crossed her arms over her chest. Not coldly, just the automatic posture of a woman who'd spent 4 years being her own shelter, and watched him set the first log. He split it in one swing. The sound cracked out across the yard and scattered a group of sparrows from the fence rail. "Show off," she muttered. He almost smiled. "Go inside, Eleanor. I'll bring the wood in when I'm done." She didn't move right away. She stood there another few seconds, like she was considering arguing on principle, then turned and walked toward the porch without another word. At the door she stopped, hand on the frame, and looked back at him. "I'll put coffee on," she said. It wasn't a thank you. It was something more complicated than that. "I'd appreciate it," he said. She went inside. Colt swung the axe and didn't think about anything for a while. That was the good thing about physical work. It shut the more inconvenient parts of your mind down if you did it hard enough. The wood split. The pile grew. His shoulders burned in a way that felt honest. Out past the fence, the mountains sat white and gray against a pale sky, patient as they always were, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding at their feet. He worked for an hour, maybe a little more. When he stacked the last piece and knocked the mud off his boots and pushed through the kitchen door, the smell of coffee hit him like something from a memory he hadn't visited in a while. Eleanor's kitchen was the same as it had always been. Cast iron stove pushed against the north wall, table with 4 chairs when 3 would have been enough. A window above the sink that looked out toward the old oak Samuel had planted the year he and Eleanor got married. There was a crack in one of the table legs that Colt had fixed himself 2 winters ago. It still held. Eleanor had her back to him, filling 2 mugs. She'd taken her coat off and changed into a dry shirt. Her hair was still in its work braid, dark brown gone, mostly gray at the temples. She moved around her kitchen the way people moved in spaces that were entirely their own. Economical, certain, no wasted motion. She set his mug on the table and sat down across from it, leaving the seat for him without saying so. He sat. For a minute neither of them said anything. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up and was making a sound in the eaves that was somewhere between a moan and a whistle. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know. I want to be clear that I wasn't struggling." She said it directly, not defensively, like she was stating a fact she needed on the record. Colt wrapped both hands around the mug. "I know that too." She looked at him across the table. It wasn't the first time she'd really looked at him. She'd known him since he was a lanky 12-year-old trailing after Gideon and tracking mud into this very kitchen, but something about the angle of the morning light, or the stillness of the moment, or some other factor he couldn't have named made it feel different, like she was seeing something she hadn't been looking for. Whatever it was, she looked away first. "Gideon says you might be moving on come spring," she said. "That the Harper spread is offering you a foreman position up north. He shouldn't be spreading my business around." "He's worried about you." Colt set his mug down. "He shouldn't be. He's 26 years old, and you're his closest friend. He's allowed to worry." I haven't decided anything yet." Eleanor nodded slowly, like she was filing that information somewhere. "This part of the territory gets under people's skin," she said. "Some men leave and spend the rest of their lives coming back in their heads." Did Samuel ever think about leaving? The question came out before he'd considered whether it was a good idea to ask it. He watched her face and saw the small tightening around her eyes that Samuel's name always brought. Not grief exactly anymore, something more worn than that. Like a stone that's been carried so long it's shaped itself to the hand that holds it. "Every winter," she said. "First hard freeze every year, he'd start talking about California. Said a man could grow oranges there. Didn't know the first thing about oranges. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. Come spring, he'd be out there mending fence before the snow was even off the ground. He was never going anywhere. No, Colt said. He wasn't. Another quiet stretched between them. Colt became aware that he had been here longer than he'd meant to be, and that leaving now felt harder than it should. I'll check your south fence line on my way back, he said, pushing his chair back. One of the posts on the hill was leaning last time I came through. Eleanor looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know. Colt. Something in her voice was different when she said his name that way. Measured, careful, like she was picking up something fragile and wasn't sure of her grip. I'm aware that you've been... She stopped. Started again. You've been good to this ranch, to me, since Samuel died. I want you to know I don't take that for granted. He stood at the edge of the kitchen, hat in his hands. The morning light had shifted and was coming in longer through the window now, lying across the floor in thin yellow planks. You don't have to say that, he said. I know I don't, she said. I'm saying it anyway. He nodded. There was something that wanted to climb up out of his chest right then, and he kept it firmly in place. This was Gideon's mother. This was the woman who'd patched his arm when he cut it on a wire fence at 14. This was the kitchen where he'd eaten more meals than he could count. There were limits to the world, and some of them were there for good reasons. He put his hat on. I'll look at the fence, he said. He walked out before she could tell him he didn't have to. Outside, the cold air hit him clean, and he stood on the porch for a moment, his breath making small pale clouds, looking out at the mountains. The wood he'd split was stacked against the wall in a neat row, enough to keep the stove fed for several days if she was careful about it. The feeling in his chest hadn't gone anywhere. He'd been carrying it for longer than he wanted to admit, he realized. Not since this morning, not since he'd watched her struggle alone with that axe. Longer. Since the previous winter, maybe, when she'd laughed at something he said about a broken wagon wheel. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that changed a person's whole face. And something had shifted in him so quietly he almost hadn't noticed. Almost. He stepped off the porch and started toward the south fence line, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded a lot like reason reminded him of everything that could go wrong if he followed this feeling even one step further. He knew it was right, that voice. He also knew he was going to check her fence post, and that tomorrow, when he found another reason to come by, he was going to do that too. Some things don't ask your permission before they take root. They just grow, stubborn and quiet, like the scrub pines at the edge of the Whitlock property. Leaning a little in the wind, maybe, but holding on to ground they'd chosen for themselves long before anyone thought to ask whether they belonged there. Colt Brennan walked to the fence. Above him, the Montana sky was bone white and enormous, and it didn't care one bit what he decided. It never did. The frontier was like that. Indifferent in the most absolute way possible, offering nothing but the chance to be whatever you were willing to be, and then standing back to see what you did with it. He found the leaning post. It was worse than he remembered. He went back to the barn for a mallet. Back in the kitchen, Eleanor Whitlock stood at the window above the sink and watched him cross the yard. Her coffee had gone cold in her hands. She didn't drink it. She stood there until he disappeared around the side of the barn, and then she stood there a little longer. Then she set the mug down, picked up the dish rag, and got back to work. Because that was what you did. That was what she'd always done. But for the first time in a long time, the rhythm of it felt different. Not wrong, exactly, just different. The fence post held after Colt reset it, but he knew it wouldn't last the winter. The ground on the south hill had a way of shifting when the hard freezes came, pushing things up from below like the earth was trying to reject whatever had been driven into it. He'd mentioned it to Gideon twice in the past year. Gideon had nodded both times the way men nod when they're listening but not really hearing, and the post had never gotten replaced. Colt replaced it himself 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when he knew Gideon was in town. He told himself he was just being practical. A broken fence line meant cattle drifting, and drifting cattle on this stretch of territory meant arguments with the neighboring Crane family, who had never been friendly and had gotten less so since old Harold Crane decided the Whitlock property line was a matter of personal interpretation. It was a practical thing, a neighborly thing, the kind of thing any decent man would do. He almost believed it. By the time December arrived and locked the valley under 6 inches of snow, Colt had fixed the fence post, rehung the barn door that had been dragging since September, patched a section of roof on the smaller outbuilding where Eleanor stored her dry goods, and split enough firewood to keep the main house warm through February. He'd done all of it in pieces, stretched across different days, never making a production of any single job, never staying longer than the work required. Eleanor had stopped protesting after the first couple of visits. She hadn't stopped noticing. One afternoon in early December, Colt was in the barn working on a harness that had cracked along the main strap when he heard boots on the frozen ground outside. The door swung open and Gideon Whitlock came in, shaking snow off his coat and pulling his hat off his head in the same motion. Gideon was built like his father had been, broad through the shoulders, thick in the hands, with a face that was honest in the way that some faces just are, where you can read most of what the man is thinking if you bother to look. He and Colt had grown up side by side in the way that frontier boys do, thrown together by proximity and boredom and the shared understanding that the world was large and mostly indifferent and you needed someone at your back in it. 18 years of friendship left marks on a person. Colt knew Gideon's silences as well as he knew his words, sometimes better. Right now the silence that came in with him had a particular quality to it. "Didn't know you were coming by," Colt said, not looking up from the harness. "Wasn't sure I was." Gideon moved into the barn and leaned against a stall post, crossing his arms. He looked at the harness, then at Colt, then at the general middle distance that men look at when they're working something out. "Martha Hale asked me about you today." Colt set the harness down. "What did Martha Hale want to know about me?" "Said she'd seen you coming and going from here, several times." Gideon paused. "Said she thought maybe you'd taken a position with the ranch." "Martha Hale needs more to occupy herself." "Probably." Gideon picked up a spare buckle from the workbench and turned it over in his fingers without looking at it. "I told her you were just helping out, being neighborly." "That's accurate." "Is it?" The barn was quiet except for one of the horses moving in its stall and the wind pressing against the boards outside. Colt looked at his best friend and Gideon looked back at him, and 18 years of knowing each other sat between them like a third person in the room. "What are you asking me, Gideon?" Gideon set the buckle down. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had been hoping he was wrong about something and was coming to terms with the possibility that he wasn't. "I'm asking you what's going on." "I've been helping with some repairs. Your south fence post was—" "Colt." The way he said it made Colt stop. Gideon exhaled through his nose, slow and careful. "I'm not blind," he said, "and I'm not stupid. I've watched you come out here every few days for 2 months. I've watched you find reasons." He looked down at the workbench. "I've watched my mother." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. The kind you can't take back once it's been allowed to exist. Colt didn't say anything for a long moment. Part of him wanted to deflect, to find the right words that were technically honest but left the important things unexamined. He was good enough with language that he probably could have managed it. Gideon might have let him, but there was something about the way Gideon was standing there, not accusing, not exploding, just asking him the way a friend asks when they already suspect the answer and just need to hear it out loud. That made deflection feel like the worst possible thing he could do. "I don't know how to explain it to you in a way that makes it sound like what it is instead of what it looks like," Colt said. Gideon looked up. "Try." "I'm not—" Colt stopped, started again. "I haven't done anything. I want to be clear about that first. I haven't said anything to her. I haven't acted on anything. I fixed some fence and split some wood and had coffee in the kitchen, the same as I've been doing since I was 12 years old. But, Colt picked up the harness again, more to have something in his hands than because he intended to work on it. Something changed. For me. I don't know when exactly. I don't know if there was a specific moment or if it just built up, but I'm aware of it, and I think it's not going away." Gideon was quiet for a long time, long enough that Colt started to brace for what might come next, Anger, maybe, or that particular cold withdrawal that was in some ways worse than anger, where a man just pulled himself back behind his eyes and stopped letting you in. What came instead was a question he hadn't expected. Does she know? No? You sure about that? Colt thought about Eleanor standing at the window after he'd split her wood, about the way she'd handed him his coffee without being asked how he took it, because she'd known for years, about the things she'd done with her eyes that morning, the looking and then the deliberate looking away. I'm not sure of much, he admitted. Gideon turned and walked to the barn door and stood there with his hand on the frame, looking out at the snow. His back was to Colt, and Colt couldn't see his face. She's my mother, Gideon said. His voice was flat in the way voices get when a person is controlling them carefully. She's 42 years old and you're 24, and she's been my mother's age your entire life. I know. People in this settlement will have things to say about it. Ugly things. I know that too. And you still... I can't talk myself out of it, Gideon. Believe me, I've tried. Gideon was quiet again. Outside, a gust of wind moved through the yard and lifted a small spiral of snow up from the ground near the water trough. It spun for a moment and then dissolved. I need you to go home, Gideon said finally. Tonight. I need you to go home and give me some time to sit with this. All right. I'm not telling you what I think yet. I don't know what I think yet. That's fair. Colt. Gideon turned around. His face was complicated in a way that Colt had never quite seen on it before. Something between grief and confusion and an exhausted kind of love that had nowhere obvious to land. If I tell you this can't happen, if I tell you I can't be okay with it, what do you do? It was the most important question anyone had asked him in recent memory, maybe ever, and Colt had the answer before he'd consciously found it, sitting there plain and clear at the center of everything he understood about himself and what actually mattered. Then I walk away from it, he said. Your friendship is not something I'll trade. Not for anything. Gideon looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded, once, and walked out of the barn into the snow. Colt sat back down on the stool and put his hands on his knees and stared at nothing for a while. He hadn't told Gideon everything. He'd been honest, but honesty and completeness weren't always the same thing. What he hadn't said was that walking away from it wasn't the same as making it disappear. He could leave. He could stop coming by, stop finding reasons, stop letting himself think too far ahead. He could do all of that, and the feeling would still be there in the morning, patient and immovable as the mountains, indifferent to whatever decision he made about it. But that wasn't Gideon's problem to carry. That one was his alone. 3 days passed, then 4. Colt stayed on the Harper spread and did his work and didn't ride past the Whitlock property line. On the 5th evening, Gideon showed up at the bunkhouse after supper and sat across the table from him and wrapped his hands around a cup of coffee the way his mother did and didn't say anything for a while. She was up before sunrise this morning, Gideon said finally. Same as always. She had the stove going and she'd already done half the morning chores before I even got my boots on. He stared into the cup. I asked her when the last time was that she slept past 6, and she said she couldn't remember, laughed when she said it, like it was just a fact about herself she'd gotten used to. Colt waited. She works herself into the ground, Gideon said, has been doing it for 4 years. I help where I can, but I'm one person and she won't ask for more than she thinks is fair, which is nothing. He rubbed the back of his neck. She's lonely, Colt. I've watched her be lonely for 4 years and I kept thinking it would get better and it just doesn't. She's doing fine. She's always doing fine. But doing fine and being happy aren't the same thing, and I think I stopped noticing the difference. Gideon, I'm not finished. He set the cup down. I grew up watching my parents together. It wasn't like some storybook thing. They argued. My dad could be stubborn in ways that drove her absolutely crazy. She wasn't always easy either. A short, private sound that was almost a laugh. But they respected each other. They showed up for each other. And when he was gone, something went out of her that hasn't come back. He looked up. I've also been watching you for 2 months, he said. The way you are when you're over there, the way you pay attention. He paused. My mother doesn't let many people pay attention to her. She deflects. You've noticed that. She's good at it. She's very good at it. Gideon picked up the cup again, set it back down without drinking. I don't know if this is a good idea. I genuinely don't. I think the whole settlement is going to have opinions about it, and most of those opinions are going to be unpleasant. I think there are 100 ways it could go wrong. He met Colt's eyes across the table. But I'm not going to be the one who stands between my mother and the possibility of something better. I can't be that person. The bunkhouse was very quiet. That's not me giving you my blessing or whatever you want to call it, Gideon said, with an edge that was made of something real, something that hurt. That's me saying I'm not going to be an obstacle. Those are different things. I understand the difference. And Colt, the edge sharpened. If you hurt her, if you let her open that door and then you walk away from it because you're young and something better comes along or the age gap starts to feel real or whatever other reason, I will not forgive it. That is not a threat. That is just me being honest about who I am. I know who you are, Colt said, and I know what I'm saying when I say I won't. Gideon nodded slowly. He looked older than 26 right then. He looked like someone carrying a weight he hadn't planned on and was figuring out how to distribute it. How does she feel? He asked. The question was quieter than the others, less controlled. I don't know, Colt said honestly. I haven't said anything. But you think... I think she's aware of it. I think it scares her. Gideon was quiet for a moment. It should, he said. It's a scary thing. He left a little while after that, and Colt sat alone at the table for a long time after his boots had gone quiet in the snow outside. The lamp was burning low, and he didn't bother to turn it up. He just sat in the half-dark and tried to organize his thoughts into something manageable and found that they resisted, the way thoughts do when they've outgrown the tidy categories you've built to hold them. The rumors had started before he even knew there were rumors. He found out indirectly, the way most news traveled in Harlan Creek, through a comment that landed sideways. He was at Decker's supply store picking up a spool of wire when Bill Hester, who ran cattle on the north side of the valley and had never been a man who kept unnecessary opinions to himself, appeared at his elbow with a sack of flour and a look on his face that combined friendliness with a pointed quality Colt recognized immediately. You've been spending some time at the Whitlock place, Bill said. Not a question. Some, Colt said. Widow's Ranch, Bill said, like Colt might have forgotten. Eleanor's a good woman, capable woman. She is. Bill set his flour on the counter. She's also nearly twice your age, he said pleasantly, the way people say unpleasant things when they want the cover of a conversational tone. Just something a young man might want to think about. People talk in a small place like this. It's not always kind. Colt looked at him. I appreciate the concern, he said, in a voice that made it clear he didn't particularly. He paid for his wire and left, but the conversation sat with him on the ride back. Not because Bill Hester's opinion mattered in any essential way, but because Bill Hester was a preview of every look and muttered comment and raised eyebrow that would follow if things moved in the direction they were moving. Small settlements ran on gossip the way machinery ran on grease. It was practical, it was constant, and it got into everything. He didn't mention the conversation to Eleanor. There wasn't anything to mention yet, technically. But that evening, when he stopped by with a section of cedar rail he'd salvaged for the garden fence she'd been meaning to repair, and she came out on the porch with her hands in her apron and that look on her face that was simultaneously guarded and not entirely unwelcoming, he understood for the first time the full weight of what was sitting between them. It wasn't just feeling. It wasn't just inconvenient timing or the awkward mathematics of their ages or the fact that he'd known her since she was a different version of herself, young and certain, her hair still entirely dark. It was all of that, yes, but underneath it was something heavier and more honest. The knowledge that whatever this was, if they let it become something, it would cost them both. Not equally. Eleanor would bear the larger portion of the cost, the way women always did in small places with long memories. She came down the porch steps and looked at the cedar rail. I wasn't going to do that fence until spring, she said. Cedar holds better if you set it before the ground freezes hard. She looked at him. The last light was going behind the mountains, and it caught the side of her face in a way that was specific and particular, and he filed it away somewhere he didn't examine too closely. You talked to Gideon, she said. It wasn't a question. Something moved through him. Surprise, mostly. What makes you say that? Because he was different at breakfast this week. Quieter. And you haven't been by in 5 days. She tilted her head slightly. 2 and 2. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I talked to him. Eleanor looked at the cedar rail, then at the fence, then, carefully, at some point beyond both of them, out toward the tree line where the last color was draining out of the sky. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what that conversation was about, she said. Her voice was even, measured, the voice of a woman who had decided to be honest because anything else would have been beneath her. And I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed what has and hasn't been said between us. Eleanor, let me finish. She looked at him directly then, and there was something in her eyes that was neither the warmth he hoped for, nor the firm rejection he'd halfway prepared himself for. It was more complicated than either. I am a practical woman. I've had to be, and I know the practical things about this situation. The age, the talk, the history, what people in this valley will make of it. I know all of those things. I know you do. What I don't know, she said, slower now, is what to do with the rest of it. She looked at her own hands briefly, then back at him. I haven't let myself feel much of anything for 4 years. It seemed like the safest way to keep moving forward. And then you... She stopped. The even voice wavered, very slightly, just enough for him to notice. You make it harder to keep doing that. The wind moved between them. Somewhere up the slope, a branch cracked under the weight of ice. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, Colt said. He meant it. I just want you to know that I'm not confused about what this is. I'm not 24 years old and lonely and reaching for the nearest available. He stopped and chose his words more carefully. Whatever this is for me, it isn't simple and it isn't small. I know the difference. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. I believe you, she said quietly. And then, because she was Eleanor, and honesty was the thing she defaulted to even when it would have been easier not to. That's almost the scariest part. She picked up one end of the cedar rail. After a second, he picked up the other. They carried it to the fence together, and neither of them said another word about it. But the silence had changed. It had weight now, and shape, and a specific texture that both of them recognized, though neither was quite ready to name it out loud. Winter was barely getting started. There were months of cold still ahead, months of short days and long dark evenings and fires that needed tending and work that never stopped. And somewhere in all of that, a question that was growing too substantial to keep ignoring. Colt drove the first stake into the frozen ground and felt it resist beneath his hands, hard and unyielding as everything in this country seemed to be. He hit it again. It went down. The cedar fence went up crooked on one end, and Colt had to pull the second post and reset it twice before it sat level. Eleanor pointed this out from 6 feet away with the matter-of-fact bluntness she applied to most things, and he told her he knew, and she said she was just mentioning it, and he said he understood that she was mentioning it, and something about the ordinariness of that small exchange, the minor friction of it, 2 people slightly annoying each other over a fence post in the cold, felt more real and more grounding than anything that had passed between them in weeks. That was January. February came in mean, the kind of cold that Montana produces when it decides to remind everyone living in it that their presence is conditional and always has been. Temperatures that dropped below 0 before midnight and stayed there. Wind that found every gap in every structure and made itself comfortable. Livestock that needed checking twice daily because the troughs were freezing faster than they could be broken open. Colt was busy from before light until after dark every day, and so was everyone else on every ranch in the valley. And for a while, the sheer physical demand of winter pushed most other things to the margins where they sat, patient and unresolved, waiting for the weather to ease up. He still came by the Whitlock place, maybe 3 times a week instead of 5. He told himself it was because the roads were bad, and the Harper spread needed more of his hours in the deep freeze. Both of those things were true. They were also not the complete reason. The complete reason was more tangled than that, and he was getting better at admitting it to himself even if he still hadn't found the right words to say it out loud. Gideon met him at the gate one Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of February. His face was drawn in a way that Colt recognized as more than just cold and fatigue. She's sick, Gideon said without preamble. Colt felt something drop in his chest. How sick? It's not dangerous, I don't think. Gideon pulled his coat tighter. Fever. Started 2 days ago. She won't stay in bed more than an hour at a stretch. Yesterday morning, I came downstairs and she was at the stove making breakfast and her hands were shaking. He said it with a specific kind of frustration that belonged to people who loved stubborn people. I told her to go back upstairs and she told me she was fine, and then she burned the oatmeal because she couldn't hold the spoon steady. Is she sleeping? When I make her. He exhaled and his breath clouded in the air. I need help with the morning chores. I don't want to leave her alone inside too long. I know, Colt said. Let's go. They worked through the morning, feeding, watering, breaking ice on the troughs, checking the cattle in the lower pasture where the snow had drifted against the fence in the night. They didn't talk much. The work didn't require it. Around mid-morning, Colt went into the barn to fix a broken latch on one of the stall doors, and Gideon came and leaned against the doorframe the way he had that afternoon back in December, and Colt recognized the posture as the one his friend wore when something was sitting on him that he hadn't decided whether to say. She asked about you this morning, Gideon said. Colt kept working the latch. What did she ask? If you were coming by. A pause. I said I'd asked you to help with chores. She said good. Another pause. Longer. She looked better for about 10 minutes after I told her. I'm not sure she realized it. Colt set down the screwdriver. He looked at the latch. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say. I've been thinking, Gideon said. I know, you get that look. What look? The one like you're carrying something heavy and trying to figure out which shoulder to shift it to. Gideon made a sound that was almost a laugh. I've been thinking about what my father's life looked like from the outside, he said, and what it looked like from the inside, because those were different things. He pushed off the door frame and walked a few steps into the barn. From the outside, it looked like he had everything he needed: ranch, family, woman who loved him. From the inside, I think he spent a lot of years being one version of himself when there were maybe 2 or 3 other versions that never got to exist. He paused. He made his choices. I'm not saying they were wrong, but I've been thinking about how a person can be completely responsible and completely present and still be hollow in a way. In a quiet way that doesn't show until you look close. Colt waited. My mother has been hollow for 4 years, Gideon said. I got used to it because it happened gradually. But then about 2 months ago, I started actually looking, instead of just seeing what I expected to see, and he stopped. His jaw tightened briefly. You make her less hollow. I don't know how else to say it. I've watched it. It's not subtle once you start looking for it. Gideon, I'm not trying to push you toward anything. I'm just... He stopped again. Seemed frustrated with himself, the way a man gets when the thing he's trying to say keeps coming out less precise than the feeling that's generating it. She's not going to let herself have this easily. You know that. She's going to find 100 reasons why it doesn't make sense, and she's going to believe all of them because she's been sensible for so long it's become her whole identity. I know. So I'm telling you. He looked at Colt directly. Don't give up on it because she makes it hard. She makes everything hard. That's just how she's built. The barn held its silence around them. That's a significant thing for you to say, Colt said. I'm aware of that. Gideon's voice was level, but the effort of keeping it level was visible if you knew where to look. It took me a while to get here. I won't pretend otherwise. There were about 3 days in January where I was angry about it in a way I wasn't proud of. He picked up the screwdriver Colt had set down and turned it in his hand. But I kept coming back to the same thing. She's 50 years old if she lives to her mother's age. She's used up 42 of them. I don't have the right to decide how she uses the ones she has left based on what makes me comfortable. He set the screwdriver back down. Just be patient with her, he said. She needs time to talk herself into things she's already decided. He went back to the house to check on Eleanor, and Colt finished the latch, and outside the wind moved through the valley with the flat, cold efficiency that February specialized in, indifferent to what was or wasn't being worked out in the small spaces where people tried to live their lives inside it. Eleanor was in the kitchen when he came in to wash up before noon. She was sitting at the table, which meant Gideon had won at least one argument that morning. She had a quilt around her shoulders and a cup of something hot in front of her, and her hair was down, which Colt had almost never seen. It was longer than he'd realized, falling past her shoulders, and the gray in it was more than at the temples. Threaded throughout, silver white against the darker brown, and it suited her in a way that was so specifically her own that it took him a beat longer than it should have to move his eyes to a neutral point in the room. She looked up when he came in. Her face was pale, and there were shadows under her eyes, and her voice when she spoke was rougher than usual, scraped thin by 2 days of fever. "Gideon said you were here. Came to help with chores." He moved to the wash basin, kept his back to her. "How are you feeling?" "I've felt worse." High praise. She made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not one. "Sit down if you're going to be in here. You hovering near the door makes me anxious." He dried his hands and sat across from her at the table where he'd had more cups of coffee than he could count, the table with the crack in the leg he'd fixed 2 winters ago. Familiar as anything in his life, and also, right now, with Eleanor's hair down and her face scrubbed clean of its usual composure, something more than familiar, something that sat alongside familiar without replacing it. "Gideon worries too much," she said. "He worries exactly the right amount. You're the one who's got the calibration wrong." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I raised that boy. Don't tell me he worries the right amount." "You also raised him to be perceptive and stubborn, and he got both of those honestly." The corner of her mouth moved. She set the cup down and pulled the quilt a little tighter, and in the movement he caught a flash of how tired she actually was underneath the maintenance of her usual self, the real exhaustion, not the surface kind. "Eleanor," he said. He hadn't planned to say anything specific. The conversation in the barn was still settling in him, and he hadn't yet organized what it meant or what came next. But she looked at him when he said her name, and the directness of it, just her eyes, clear and tired and waiting, pulled the rest of it out of him before he'd decided to let it go. "When the weather breaks, when you're not sitting here with a fever, I want to have a conversation with you." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind we've been not having for about 3 months." She looked down at the table, at her hands around the cup, at some specific point on the wood grain that she studied with more attention than it required. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that conversation," she said. "I know. I'm not asking you to be ready today. I'm telling you it's coming so you can't pretend it isn't." She looked up at him then, and something shifted in her face. The careful neutrality she kept in place like a hand pressed against a wound. It shifted, and underneath it was something more complicated and more honest, something that might have been fear, or might have been the thing that lives right next to fear and sometimes gets mistaken for it. "You're 24 years old," she said, flat, like a fact being entered into evidence. "I'm aware of that." "I'm 42. I can do the arithmetic." "Colt." She said it the way she said it when she wanted him to be serious. He was serious. She could see that he was serious, and it seemed to unsettle her more than she'd anticipated. "This makes no sense. By any practical measure, this makes no sense at all." "I know," he said. "I've made that argument to myself probably 200 times. It's a good argument. It just doesn't change anything." She stared at him. "Rest," he said, standing up. "Drink whatever Gideon made you. I'll check the east pasture on my way out." "Colt!" He was almost to the door. "What if I'm too set in my ways? What if I've been doing this alone for so long that I don't... What if I've forgotten how to let someone in?" He turned back. She was looking at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way he'd almost never seen on her, and he understood that the fever had something to do with it, had dissolved some of the outer layers she kept lacquered in place against the world. "Then we figure that out," he said. "I'm not asking you to be easy about it. I'm just asking you not to decide it's impossible before we've tried." He left her sitting at the table with her cold cup and her quilt and whatever was turning over in her head, and he went out through the porch door into the gray February air and stood for a moment with his hands on the railing, looking out at the mountains that were white all the way down to the tree line now. March was worse before it got better. The break in the weather that Colt had been waiting on came in fits and starts. A warm day followed by a hard freeze, followed by 3 days of snow that undid whatever the warmth had started. Eleanor recovered from the fever, but not before it had settled in her chest for an extra week, leaving her with a cough that woke her at night and irritated her greatly because it interfered with her ability to pretend she was completely fine. Meanwhile, The community of Harlan Creek had arrived at a consensus about the situation at the Whitlock Ranch that wasn't particularly generous. Colt became aware of the full shape of it on a Saturday when he rode into town for supplies, and encountered, over the course of 2 hours, 3 separate interactions that each communicated the same general message through slightly different packaging. Ruth Decker, who ran the dry goods counter for her husband and had a gift for conveying enormous amounts of social information through the most minimal adjustments to her expression, gave him his change from the flower purchase with a smile that said she knew something and had opinions about it. Reverend Miles, who ran the small settlement church and had apparently appointed himself a community conscience, made a comment about young men and impulsive decisions in a conversation that had ostensibly been about the weather. And Tom Briggs, who was direct in the way that people sometimes mistake for honesty, said outright at the water trough, "Word is you've been chasing the Whitlock widow. I'll tell you what I'd tell my own son. There's plenty of young women in this valley who won't bring complications with them." Colt thanked him for the advice in the voice he reserved for advice he had no intention of taking, and rode back toward the Whitlock Ranch with a particular feeling in his chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite resolve, but was somewhere between them and considerably warmer than either. He found Gideon splitting wood in the yard, the same task Eleanor had been struggling with the morning all of this started, which struck him as significant in some way he couldn't fully articulate. Gideon looked up when he came through the gate and read something in his face immediately. "Town?" Gideon said. "Town," Colt confirmed. Gideon planted the axe in the stump and straightened up. "People talking?" "People talking." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What are they saying?" "The usual things people say when they've decided they understand a situation they're looking at from the outside." Gideon nodded slowly. He looked up at the house, at the window where a light was burning in the kitchen. Eleanor was inside. She'd been trying to get the accounts organized all afternoon, which Colt knew because Gideon had mentioned it when he'd arrived, half complaint and half pride. Even with a cough still hanging on from the fever, she was at the table working on the books. "She's going to hear about it," Gideon said. "If she hasn't already." "I know. It's going to give her reasons." He said it with the weariness of a man who knew his mother well. "She collects reasons when she's trying to talk herself out of something. She'll take everything those people are saying and she'll build a wall with it." "I know that too." Gideon looked at him. "So what are you going to do?" Colt thought about Tom Briggs at the water trough with his helpful advice, about Ruth Decker's calibrated smile, about the small architecture of social pressure that small places built up around anything that didn't fit the expected shapes. Not always malicious, sometimes even well-meaning, but effective all the same. Heavy. "I'm going to let her," Colt said. Gideon frowned. "Let her build the wall. Let her build it, and then be there on the other side of it." He looked at the house, at the light in the kitchen window. "She has to decide for herself. I can't decide it for her, and I won't try. All I can do is make sure she knows I'm not going anywhere while she's deciding." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was difficult to name. Something that was part older than his years and part just tired and part something else. Something that was maybe what acceptance actually looks like from close up, which is less graceful than people imagine and more like a scar that has finished hurting. "Okay," he said. He picked up the axe again. "You should probably go in. She's been at those books for 3 hours and the numbers aren't coming out right. And when the numbers don't come out right, she gets... I know how she gets." "Right." A pause. "Yeah, you do." Colt went up the porch steps and pushed through the kitchen door into the warmth and the smell of wood smoke. And Eleanor was at the table exactly as described, the account ledger open in front of her and a pencil behind her ear and that particular crease between her eyebrows that showed up when something wasn't adding up the way she expected. She looked up. The crease didn't go away, but something in her eyes shifted. "You were in town," she said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Steadily, and with the expression of a woman who had heard things, or expected she was about to, or had already started preparing herself for them. He said. Her expression didn't change on the surface, but something underneath it did. Small and careful, like a thing unclenching that has been clenched for a long time. She looked back at her ledger. "There's coffee on the stove," she said. "The column on the left isn't adding up, and I can't find the error." He poured himself a cup and sat down across from her and looked at the column on the left. The error was in the third row from the bottom. A transposition, 2 digits switched. He pointed to it without saying anything, through her nose. 4 hours, she said. I've been staring at that for 4 hours. Fresh eyes, he said. She erased the number and rewrote it correctly, and the column came out right on the next try. She closed the ledger. The kitchen was quiet in the way it was getting comfortable being quiet. Not empty, not awkward, just 2 people in the same space sharing the particular peace of not needing to fill every moment with words. Outside, the sound of Gideon's axe hitting wood carried through the walls in a steady rhythm. I heard what Tom Briggs said to you at the trough, Eleanor said, not looking up. He waited. Someone told Nora Finch, who told Martha Hale, who apparently felt I needed to know. She kept her hands flat on the closed ledger. Word travels fast in a small place. It does. He's not the only one who thinks it. She looked up then. Her eyes were steady and clear and doing the thing they did when she was choosing honesty over ease. I've had 3 women express concern for my welfare in the past 2 weeks. In that particular way where the concern is really about their own discomfort. I know. It's going to keep happening. She said it plainly. Not as a complaint, as a fact requiring acknowledgement. This valley has a long memory and a short tolerance for things that don't look the way things are supposed to look. I know that. And it doesn't... She stopped. Her jaw tightened briefly. He watched her work through something internally, watched the effort it took, and didn't try to help her with it because she didn't need that kind of help. It doesn't change anything for you. No, he said. It doesn't. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the fire in the stove shifted and settled with a sound like a sigh. I don't know what to do with you, she said finally. And it came out not as frustration, or not only as frustration, but as something more undefended than that. Something that sounded, if you listened carefully, like a woman standing at the edge of a decision she'd been pretending she hadn't already made. You don't have to do anything with me tonight, he said. No. She stood up, gathered the ledger, held it against her chest the way she held things she wasn't sure what to do with. But you're right that the conversation is coming. She said it quietly, like it cost her something. I can see that. He nodded. She stood there another moment, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She put the ledger down on the counter and she said, Finish your coffee, in a voice that was neither warm nor cold, but was specifically the voice of a woman choosing to allow something she hadn't allowed before. He finished his coffee. Gideon came in from the cold 20 minutes later, stomping snow off his boots in the doorway, and the 3 of them ate supper together around the table with the cracked leg, talking about the cattle count and the east fence, and whether the thaw would come early this year or late. Ordinary things. The kind of things that fill the space between people who are figuring out what they are to each other, one ordinary evening at a time. It wasn't resolved. It was nowhere near resolved. But something had shifted again, something subtle and structural, like a wall that hasn't come down but has developed a door. Later, riding back in the dark along the trail he knew well enough to follow without much light, Colt could see the Whitlock ranch house from the ridge. One window still lit against the dark, small and warm and steady in the black of the Montana night. He didn't let himself look at it for long. He rode on, but he knew which window it was. The thaw came late that year. Not until the second week of April did the valley finally exhale. The snowpack pulling back from the lower pastures in slow retreat, the creek running loud and brown with melt, the mud so deep in the yard that it swallowed boot heels and held them. Spring in Montana wasn't gentle. It was just a different kind of hard. Colt was repairing the gate hinge on the main entrance to the Whitlock property when Eleanor came out of the house and walked across the yard toward him with her coat on and her hands in her pockets, and something in her posture that told him she'd made a decision about something. He'd learned to read her the way you learn to read weather in open country. Not always accurately, but with enough familiarity to know when something was building. She stopped a few feet away and watched him work for a moment. Gideon's gone to the Finch place, she said. He'll be there through supper. I know, he mentioned it. So it's just us here this afternoon. He set down the wrench, turned around. She was looking at him with that particular directness that she defaulted to when she'd already spent all the time she intended to spend on indecision. and he recognized it from the dozens of small moments in the past months when she'd said something honest after a long silence and then lived with whatever came next. "All right," he said. "I want to have that conversation now," she said. "The one you told me was coming." Something shifted in his chest. He leaned back against the gatepost and crossed his arms, not defensively, just because he needed to be still. "All right," he said again. She didn't sit, neither did he. They stood in the mud in the weak April sun and looked at each other, and the air between them had the particular charge of two people who have been circling something for months and have finally stopped circling. "I've been thinking about what I'm afraid of," she said. "Not what I'm supposed to say or what makes logical sense. Those things I already know. But what I'm actually afraid of, underneath all of it." He waited. "I'm afraid of needing something," she said, "of getting used to having it. Because every time in my life that I've needed something and let myself know it, the losing of it cost more than I'd budgeted for." She said it precisely, without self-pity, like she was explaining the terms of a contract she'd been living under. Samuel dying wasn't just grief. It reorganized everything. Every daily thing that had assumed him in it had to be rebuilt without him, and that process took longer than anyone would have guessed from the outside, and She stopped. "It nearly broke me. I don't say that to many people." "I know," he said quietly. "I know you don't. So when something starts to feel necessary again," she exhaled through her nose, "the first instinct is to step back, before the debt gets too high to pay. I understand that." "Do you?" She looked at him steadily. "You're 24. You haven't lost enough yet to understand it in your body. You understand it in your head, which isn't the same thing." That landed, and he let it land, because she was right, and she deserved to be right about it. "That's fair," he said. "I'm not saying it to be cruel." "I know you're not." She looked out at the mountains for a moment. The peaks were still white from the shoulder up, but the lower elevations had been clearing for a week, and the color was coming back, the brown and gray-green of early spring making its tentative return. "I've also been thinking about what my life looks like in 10 years, she said. "If I keep doing what I've been doing, being capable and self-sufficient and not needing anything." She turned back to him. "It looks fine, from the outside. The ranch will be running, Gideon will eventually have his own family, and I will be here being capable and fine and very, very alone." He didn't say anything. He'd learned that she didn't always need him to fill the space. "I talked to Gideon," she said, "about us, about what this is, or what it might be." Something moved through him. "When?" "Last week, before you came by on Thursday." She pulled her hands out of her pockets and looked at them briefly, then back at him. "He told me something I didn't expect him to say. He said that for the past year, watching me from the inside of this house, he'd started to feel like he was watching someone run out the clock on their own life. His words, he's not usually that direct." "No," Colt said. "He usually comes at things sideways. He came at this one straight on." A small something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, but made of similar material. "He also told me that he'd already had a conversation with you in the barn in December." "Yes." "He told me what you said, when he asked what you'd do if he told you to walk away from it." Colt held her gaze. "He said you told him you would," she said, "that you'd walk away from it rather than lose the friendship." "That's what I said." "Did you mean it?" "Yes." He said it without hesitation. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. Gideon's not optional to me." She nodded slowly. Something in her seemed to settle, some specific tension releasing in her shoulders. "That answer," she said, "matters more to me than you probably realize. Because it tells me who you are. A man who would say what you think I want to hear in order to get what he wants would have said something different." "I know." "So," she took a breath, "here's what I'm able to tell you, Colt. I am able to tell you that the past 7 months that your being here, the way you've been here, has mattered to me, more than I've let on and more than I was comfortable with." She paused. "I am able to tell you that I've thought about you more than I think is reasonable for a sensible woman in my position. and I am able to tell you that I am tired. I am very tired of making every decision based on what is practical and appropriate and what this valley will or won't find acceptable. The April wind moved through the yard and lifted some loose straw from near the barn and carried it in a low spiral toward the fence. But I need you to know something, she continued. If this becomes something real, if I let it become something real, I'm not easy to be with. I've been alone long enough that I have habits and opinions and ways of doing things that I don't especially want to change. I get up before dawn because I can't sleep past it. I keep the accounts in a particular order, and I don't like them touched. I say what I think more often than is probably comfortable. And she paused. I am 18 years older than you, and there will come a day when that arithmetic means something in a way it doesn't right now, and I can't promise you I won't be afraid of that. He straightened up from the gatepost. He took 2 steps toward her, not reaching for her, just closing the distance that had been between them for months, the physical version of all the other distance they'd been managing. Eleanor, he said, I didn't fall for the idea of you. I fell for the actual version. The one who burns the coffee when she's distracted and argues about fence post placement and hasn't slept past sunrise since I've known her and says exactly what she thinks, even when it would be easier not to. He paused. I'm not asking you to change any of that. I don't want any of that changed. She looked at him with something in her eyes that was more raw than he usually got to see. You're very certain for someone who's never done this before, she said. I'm certain about the part I can be certain about, he said. The rest of it I figure we sort out as we go. She was quiet for a long moment. The mud held their boots, and the creek ran loud somewhere past the tree line, and overhead a pair of hawks were doing slow circles against the pale sky, riding the thermals without any apparent effort. I'm not going to fall apart on you, she said finally. It came out a little rough. I want you to know that, whatever happens. I've been standing on my own for a long time, and I know how. I know you do. I just don't necessarily want to anymore. She said it quietly, almost under her breath, like something that had been compressed a long time coming out of a tight space. That's the thing. That is the actual thing. He didn't say anything. He held out his hand, palm up, the same way he'd done nothing dramatic months ago in the cold morning when he'd offered to take the axe. Simple, patient, no performance to it. She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she put hers in it. Her palm was calloused and warm, and the grip she gave was characteristically direct. Not tentative, not soft. The grip of a woman who didn't do things halfway once she'd committed to them. He closed his fingers around hers, and they stood in the mud in the April sun holding on to each other for the first time. And it wasn't graceful, and it wasn't how it happened in stories, and Eleanor's eyes were doing something complicated, and Colt's heart was running faster than he was going to mention, and it was the most real thing that had happened to either of them in a long time. The settlement is going to talk, she said. She hadn't let go of his hand. The settlement already is talking. It'll get louder. Probably. She looked out at the valley, at the mountains and the mud and the hawks overhead, and the particular quality of April light that made everything look simultaneously hopeful and provisional. I spent 20 years building a reputation in this community, she said, as a capable woman, a serious woman, a woman who manages her affairs with dignity. You still are all of those things. I know that. Her jaw shifted slightly. I know that, and they'll say otherwise, and I'll have to be fine with it, and some days I won't be fine with it, and I'll probably take it out on the wrong thing. I've been working cattle for 12 years, he said. I can take some misdirected frustration. She looked at him. Something in her expression moved, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, the bones of it. Don't make jokes right now, she said. But she wasn't telling him to stop. The gate hinge still wasn't fixed, which bothered him in a low-level practical way, even as the rest of his attention was occupied with more significant things. He noticed this about himself and thought it was probably a reasonable thing to notice, that even in a moment that was reshaping things, the gate hinge was still broken and would need fixing, and the cattle still needed checking before dark, and the world kept its ordinary demands regardless of what was happening inside it. He thought Eleanor would understand that. She was, above all else, a woman who understood that the world kept its demands. They stood there a while longer, and then she squeezed his hand once, firmly, and released it. Not as a withdrawal, as a punctuation. like a period at the end of a sentence that had been running for 7 months. "Fix the hinge," she said. "Supper's at 6. He fixed the hinge. At 6 o'clock he came through the kitchen door, and Eleanor had made a beef stew that had been going since noon, and the smell of it filled the whole downstairs. Gideon arrived back from the Finch place 20 minutes later, cold and hungry, and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them. Colt already seated, Eleanor at the stove, something different in the air that wasn't loud about itself but was there. And he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pulled his coat off and hung it on the hook and said, "That smells good. I'm starving," and sat down at the table. And that was how that moment went. It was not dramatic. The stew was good. The bread was slightly overbaked on the bottom, which Eleanor noticed and mentioned with mild irritation. And Colt ate 3 portions, and Gideon talked about the Finch family's new foal that had arrived 2 weeks early and was apparently thriving against the odds. The lamp burned over the table, and the fire held in the stove, and the night settled over the Whitlock Ranch the way it always had, the mountains disappearing into the dark one layer at a time until only the stars marked where they were. After supper, Gideon washed the dishes. He'd been taking that task back from his mother since February, citing the cough that was mostly gone now, and she'd let him keep it. And Eleanor sat at the table with the account ledger she'd given up on 3 nights ago. Colt sat across from her and went through the Harper Spreads fence map that he'd been meaning to update for a month. And the table held both of them in the companionable silence that had been building between them all winter, except that now the silence meant something it hadn't meant before. Gideon dried the last dish, put it away, and looked at the two of them at the table. "I'm going to bed," he said. "Early." "It's barely 8, Eleanor said without looking up. "I'm tired," he said, in the voice of a man who was not particularly tired. He looked at Colt over Eleanor's head for just a second, a look that was complicated and honest and that contained everything they'd said to each other over the winter compressed into the span of one glance. Then he went upstairs. Eleanor looked up from the ledger. "He's not tired," she said. "No," Colt agreed. She considered this for a moment. "He's giving us time." "Yes." She looked at the account book, then closed it, which was unusual. Eleanor didn't usually close the accounts until they were finished. "He's a good son," she said quietly. There was something in her voice that belonged to the private register, the one she didn't use in front of many people. "He's a good man," Colt said. "You did that." She looked at him across the table, across the scratched wood and the lamp and the whole ordinary geography of a kitchen that had held years of living, the cracked leg on Colt's side, the window that showed nothing now but dark. "Can I tell you something?" she said, "that I probably should have said a while ago?" "Yes." "The morning you took the axe from my hands." She said it carefully. "I'd been out there for 2 hours. I knew the pile wasn't getting done, I knew my hands were a mess, and I also knew that I was not going to be the one to go knock on a neighbor's door and ask for help. That was not going to happen." A brief pause. "And then you came down off the ridge, and you didn't make a production of it. You didn't make me feel helped. You just took the axe, like it was a completely ordinary thing to do." She paused again, longer. "And I stood there watching you for a moment before I went inside, and I thought, when did that boy grow up? Not in the way you might think, just as a fact. He grew up and I hadn't been paying attention." Colt was quiet. "That's when I knew something had changed," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it. I put it in a drawer and tried to leave it there." She met his eyes. "That drawer doesn't close very well, apparently." He almost smiled. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She stood up and moved to the stove to bank the fire for the night, the last task before bed, as automatic for her as breathing. And he stayed at the table and watched her do it because it was one of those ordinary things that he'd watched without thinking for years and was now watching differently. She moved the same way she always did, certain and a little efficient, like a person who has always been the one responsible for the fire. When she turned around, he was still looking at her, and she stood there with the fireplace poker in her hand and didn't tell him to stop. "This is going to be complicated," she said. Not a warning, just a statement of the actual situation. "Most things worth doing are." She hung the poker on its hook. "Go home, Colt," she said. But she said it the same way she'd said, "Fix the hinge and finish your coffee." Like a practical instruction wrapped around something else. Like the words were one thing and the meaning was another, and both of them knew the difference now. He got his coat and his hat. At the door he turned back, and she was standing in the middle of her kitchen with the lamp burning beside her, and she looked like what she was. A woman who had survived a great deal and was maybe, cautiously, beginning to believe that surviving wasn't the ceiling. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. "Good night," she said. He rode back in the dark, and this time he did let himself look at the lit window on the ridge. He looked at it for a long moment, memorizing the particular quality of it, small and warm and stubbornly present against all that enormous dark. And then he turned his horse toward home. The valley floor was soft with melt, and the stars were out, and the creek was running hard somewhere to his left. And Colt Brennan rode through the April dark with the feeling of a man who has walked through a door he has been standing in front of for a very long time, and found that the room on the other side was exactly what he'd hoped for, and also nothing like he'd imagined, the way real things always are, the way they always will be. Behind him, the Whitlock Ranch held its light against the dark. It would still be there in the morning. The morning after Eleanor put her hand in his, Colt woke up before the Harper Spread's rooster and lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling with the particular alertness of a man whose mind has already started working before the rest of him is ready. The ceiling had a water stain in the corner that had been there since he'd moved into this bunkhouse 3 years ago. He'd looked at it 1,000 mornings. It had never looked quite the same as it did now. He was not under any illusions that the hard part was over. If anything, he understood that what had happened yesterday, Eleanor's hand in his, the closed ledger, Gideon's deliberate early bedtime, the good night at the door that meant more than the words themselves, was less an ending than a gate opening. And gates opening in this kind of country just meant more ground to cover. Spring moved through the valley the way it always did, which was to say imperfectly and on its own schedule, with no regard for what anyone had planned. The mud stayed bad through most of April. A late frost killed the first growth in Eleanor's kitchen garden, and she was brisk and tight-lipped about it for 2 days before starting the seeds over, which Colt recognized as her version of grieving small losses. Quick, private, then back to work. He helped her replant on a Saturday morning without being asked, and she directed the operation with the precision of a general and the mild irritability of someone who resents having to do the same job twice, and it was one of those ordinary hours that he stored away somewhere important without letting himself make too much of it in the moment. The settlement did not soften immediately. He hadn't expected it to. Ruth Decker's smile at the dry goods counter remained calibrated for a good while. Tom Briggs stopped making direct comments, but had a way of looking past Colt in conversation that communicated the same thing without the words. There were women who had been cordial to Eleanor for years, who found reasons to be briefly busy when she came into town, and Eleanor noticed every single one of them and said nothing and kept her chin at the same level it always was, which was the bravest thing Colt watched her do during those months, and she did it without asking for acknowledgement. There was one afternoon in May that was harder than most. Eleanor had driven the wagon into Harlan Creek for feed and come back an hour earlier than expected, and when Colt came out of the barn to help unload, he found her sitting on the wagon seat not moving, just sitting. Her hands were in her lap and she was looking at the middle distance with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not grief, not anger, something more depleted than either. He climbed up and sat beside her without asking. After a while she said, "Martha Hale told me I was making a fool of myself, to my face, in the middle of Decker's store." He didn't say anything. "She was kind about it," Eleanor said with a flat irony. "That was somehow worse. The kind way she said I was embarrassing my husband's memory." He felt something sharp move through him. He kept his hands on his knees. "I told her that Samuel had been gone for 4 years," Eleanor said, "and that his memory was not hers to manage." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing something. "And then I paid for my goods and I left." A pause. "I sat in the wagon for 10 minutes on the far end of the street before I drove home." "Eleanor, I'm not asking you to do anything about it," she said. "I'm just telling you, because I told you I'd tell you when things were hard instead of pretending they weren't, and I'm trying to actually do that instead of just saying I would." That was something they'd been building since April. Not a grand system, just the simple practice of being honest with each other about the actual shape of things. It was harder than it sounded. Eleanor's default was to process difficulty privately and present the finished version. She was working against a long habit, and she didn't always manage it. And when she didn't, she was harder on herself about it than the situation required. Colt had taken to pointing this out, which she didn't always receive graciously, and which he did anyway because it was true. Martha Hale has been unhappy in her own marriage for 15 years, he said. Everyone in this valley knows it. I know it too. She exhaled. That doesn't make it hurt less when she says it. No, he said, it doesn't. She turned and looked at him. The May sun was direct, and it showed everything. The lines around her eyes, the gray throughout her hair, the set of her jaw that was part stubbornness and part something that had been forged by 4 years of carrying weight alone. She looked like what she was. A woman who had lived her actual life without apology and was paying some of the tax for it now in a public way that wasn't fair. He reached over and put his hand over hers on her lap. Just that. She looked at it for a moment, and then she turned her hand over and held on. I'm not changing my mind, she said. Not to him exactly, to herself maybe, or to Martha Hale, or to the general direction of anyone who was waiting for her to. I know, he said. I want to be clear that I'm not. You're clear, he said. You've always been clear. She almost laughed at that. It came out a little rough around the edges, but it was real. She let go of his hand, squared her shoulders, and picked up the reins. Help me unload this feed, she said. And don't make a face like that. Like what? Like you're proud of me. It's condescending. He was absolutely proud of her, and she knew it, and he got off the wagon and started unloading feed without adjusting his expression at all, and that was that. Gideon watched all of it from a careful distance that was neither detached nor intrusive. The particular distance of a man who has made a decision and is living inside it, which is always harder than making the decision itself. There were days when Colt could see the effort it took, usually in the mornings when the three of them were in the kitchen and the domestic ordinariness of it pressed up against the old shape of things. Gideon would get quiet in a specific way, not hostile, just waited, working something through that he hadn't finished working through. Colt didn't pretend not to notice. One evening in June, he found Gideon sitting on the porch after supper, elbows on his knees, looking out at the last light going off the mountains. The kind of posture that said, leave me alone and also don't. Colt sat down next to him. For a while, neither of them said anything. The light finished going off the mountains. The first stars started showing in the eastern part of the sky. I had a dream about my father last week, Gideon said. First time in a while. What happened in it? Nothing dramatic. We were fixing the south fence, the same post you've reset 3 times now. A short sound. He was telling me I was doing it wrong. That's mostly what I remember. Him telling me I was doing it wrong and me knowing he was right and arguing anyway. Colt was quiet. I miss him, Gideon said. It came out simple and unadorned, the way the truest things sometimes do. That's it. That's all I've been sitting here thinking about. I just miss him. I know. This isn't about you, Gideon said. I want to be clear about that. Me sitting here isn't about you and my mother. It's just... He stopped. He should still be here. That's the thing I can't resolve. He should be here, and he isn't, and that doesn't have anything to do with anything else. It just is. Yeah, Colt said. They sat in that for a while. He would have liked you, Gideon said eventually. That's the other thing I keep thinking. He would have given you a hard time about the age thing, and then he would have watched you with her for about 20 minutes, and that would have been the end of his objections. He paused. He was practical that way. He cared whether people were good to each other. He cared about that more than the appearances of things. Colt looked out at the dark shape of the mountains. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was. Gideon straightened up, rolled his shoulders back. You're good to her, he said. I watch it. You don't perform it. You just do it. That matters to me. She makes it easy, Colt said. Mostly. Sometimes she makes it complicated. Gideon snorted. She makes everything complicated. She makes everything honest, Colt said, which feels complicated because most people aren't. Gideon looked at him sideways. Don't get philosophical on my porch. Your mother's porch. Our porch, Gideon said, and he said it in a way that was simple and definitive and didn't have any performance in it either. Colt received it the way it was given, as a thing meant plainly, offered once, not requiring comment. The wedding happened in September. It was not the large settlement gathering the outline of this story might suggest. Eleanor had been clear about that from the beginning, clear in the way she was clear about everything, which was to say directly and without excessive explanation. I'm not doing this for the settlement, she'd said, when Colt had asked how she wanted it done. I'm doing it for us. It can be small. It was small. It happened on the Whitlock property, on the long flat stretch of ground east of the barn where the grass had come in thick and green after the spring rains. Gideon had repaired the fence along that stretch through July and August, and he'd done it right this time, new posts set deep, the cedar rails level and tight. He hadn't mentioned it. Colt had noticed and hadn't made a production of noticing, and that was the kind of communication that had developed between them over the year. Things said in actions, received in kind. About 30 people came. Some of them were genuine in their attendance. The Hadley family from the north end of the valley, who had never been anything but decent. Old Pete Marsh, who had known Samuel since before Gideon was born, and had made his peace with the situation in the direct way of old men who have survived enough to know which things are worth carrying and which aren't. Some of the others came out of curiosity, which Eleanor was pragmatic about. Let them come, she'd said. We don't have anything to hide and we're not going to act like we do. The justice of the peace was a man named Alderman, who had traveled from 2 towns over and who performed the brief legal ceremony with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times and understood that the words were a formality around something that had already happened long before anyone had said them out loud. Eleanor wore a dress that was deep green, not a wedding dress in any traditional sense, just a dress she'd owned for years and rarely worn, brought out for the occasion because it fit, and it was the nicest thing she owned and because she was not going to stand in this field pretending to be something she wasn't, including younger than she was. She looked exactly like herself. That was the thing Colt noticed standing across from her in the September sun. How entirely like herself she looked. Not dressed up into someone else. Not performing an occasion. Just Eleanor, in her green dress, with her gray threaded hair done up in a way she'd fixed herself without anyone's help, looking at him with those direct eyes that never gave him anything he didn't actually have coming. He had worn his best shirt and cleaned his boots and combed his hair, and Gideon had looked him over before they walked out and said, "You'll do," in the voice of a man making a serious assessment, and that had been the extent of the pre-ceremony emotional processing, which suited them both. Gideon stood beside Colt during the ceremony, not off to one side, not at a symbolic distance. Right there. He'd offered it himself the week before, with a practicality that was its own kind of grace. You don't have anyone else here to stand with you, and I might as well be useful. Colt had said he'd appreciate it, and Gideon had nodded, and that was that. When Alderman finished the words and Colt put the simple band on Eleanor's finger, a band he'd had made by the metalsmith in the next town, plain silver, nothing elaborate, because Eleanor had specifically said nothing elaborate, and he'd listened. She looked at it for a moment, not with the expression of someone receiving something unexpected, with the expression of someone who has made a considered decision and is watching it become real, which is a different thing and has a different quality to it. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, which was exactly what anyone who knew her would have predicted, but they were doing something around the edges that was close enough to the other thing that it amounted to the same. Well, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. Here we are, Kit, he said. She kissed him the way she did everything. Without hesitation, once she'd decided to do it. The 30 people present made enough noise to carry across the valley. Gideon shook Colt's hand and then, in a movement that surprised both of them, pulled him into a brief, rough embrace, the kind that men who aren't practiced at embracing manage, all tension and release, over in 3 seconds, and not repeated. He stepped back and his jaw was set in the way it got when he was managing his expression carefully, and Colt nodded at him, and that was the moment. That was the whole of it. Everything that had been said and not said between them over 12 months was in that 3-second embrace and the nod after, and neither of them needed to do anything else with it. Eleanor watched this exchange from 2 feet away with the expression of a woman who is absolutely not going to cry in front of 30 people. She didn't. The afternoon went on. Pete Marsh told a story about Samuel that made Gideon laugh for the first time all day. The Hadley family's youngest daughter, who was 4, attached herself to Colt's leg for approximately 40 minutes for reasons no one could determine. Eleanor ate actual food at her own reception, which Gideon declared a minor miracle, and she told him to hush. Somebody brought a fiddle and played it badly, and eventually the sun went down behind the mountains the way it always did. Not performing, not dramatic, just fulfilling the oldest and most reliable promise in the natural world, that light returns and also ends and then returns again. By evening, the guests had gone and the 3 of them were cleaning up in the long blue dusk, folding the borrowed chairs and collecting plates, doing the ordinary work that follows any gathering because the world resumes its ordinary requirements without much delay. At some point, Gideon announced he was going to check on the cattle and disappeared down toward the lower pasture, and Colt and Eleanor were left standing in the field in the early dark, the mountains just visible against the last light, the first stars coming out over the eastern ridge. She was still wearing the green dress. She had her shoes off and was holding them by the straps, which meant her feet were bare in the cool grass, which was the most unguarded he had ever seen her outside of the kitchen when she was tired. She looked out at the valley. "This is mine," she said. She didn't say it possessively. She said it the way you say the name of something you love that you almost lost and then didn't. All of this. 20 years of it. The fence lines and the cattle and the terrible winters and the springs that come too late. "I know," he said. "And now it's ours," she said, testing the word. "That's—" She stopped. "I haven't shared it in 4 years. I've gotten used to holding all of it." "You don't have to stop holding it," he said. "I'm not here to take anything from you." She looked at him. "I know that," she said. "I think that's the part that took me the longest to believe. That you weren't after something. That you just—" She paused. "That you just wanted to be here." "Yes," he said. "That's all it ever was." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains. "I want to tell you something, and I need you not to make it into more than it is," she said. "All right. I'm happy," she said. She said it almost reluctantly, like someone admitting to a condition they hadn't fully confirmed yet. "I want you to know that I'm aware of it, that it's not something I take for granted." He looked at her profile against the pale sky, the green dress and the bare feet and the shoes in her hand and the gray threaded hair coming loose at the end of the day. The whole real, specific, unperformed fact of her. "I'm aware of it too," he said. She leaned against him. Not dramatically, just shifted her weight sideways until her shoulder was against his arm, the way you lean against a wall when you're tired, which is to say when you finally trust it to hold. He put his arm around her and they stood in the field as the dark came down full around the valley. The front porch light was on at the house. Gideon had turned it on before he went down to the cattle, which was something Samuel used to do. Always leave a light on when someone was still outside. Colt didn't know if Gideon knew he'd inherited the habit, or if it had just come through without announcement, the way things pass from one person to another, not through instruction but through proximity, through years of watching someone be who they were. Some things get lost when people go. That's real, and it doesn't soften with time as much as people say. But some things get carried forward in the people who are paying attention, and those things keep existing in a different form, which is its own kind of answer to loss. Not a comfortable one, not a complete one, but real. Life in the Whitlock, now Whitlock Brennan, ranch did not become simple after that. Eleanor's habit of pre-dawn rising never changed. She kept the accounts in her particular order and was resistant to any alternative system, which Colt had 2 opinions about and had learned to keep one of them to himself. The south fence post needed replacing again the following winter, which meant Gideon had been right that the whole section needed pulling and resetting, which nobody was pleased about. The Crane family dispute over the property line came to a head in November and required 3 separate conversations, 2 of which were unpleasant, and the third of which resulted in a reluctant and unsatisfying compromise that left everyone vaguely unhappy, which was the best available outcome, and they all knew it. The settlement shifted slowly, not in any single moment, but in the aggregate way that communities shift, grudgingly, through accumulated evidence, through the unremarkable demonstration of people living their lives with consistency and without drama. Ruth Decker's smile became less calculated by winter. Tom Briggs never exactly came around, but eventually stopped broadcasting his opinions about it, which was the version of coming around available to men like him. Martha Hale maintained her position to the end, which Eleanor had predicted from the beginning, and which bothered her less than she'd expected, which was itself a kind of freedom. By the following spring, when the valley turned green again, and the creek ran clear, and the cattle came through the winter in decent shape, and the kitchen garden went in without any late frosts to undo the work, the Whitlock Ranch had a different quality to it than it had the spring before. Not better in every sense. Nothing is. Gideon still had mornings when the weight of everything that had changed settled over him in ways he worked through alone, and he was entitled to that, and Colt gave him the space for it. Eleanor still had moments when the independence she'd built for survival felt like it was in tension with the life she was choosing now, and she was working that out one day at a time, honestly, without pretending it was simple. None of it was simple. That was not a failure. That was just what real things feel like from the inside. Complicated and specific, and nothing like the version you'd have told in advance. What was true, and remained true, and could be said plainly at the end, three people who might easily have become broken by the accumulated weight of loss and expectation and the judgment of a small place had instead decided, each in their own way, at their own cost, to choose something more honest. Gideon chose his mother's life over his own comfort, which was the kind of love that rarely gets called by its right name. Eleanor chose to stop mistaking endurance for living, which takes more courage than it sounds when you've been enduring for years and gotten good at it. Colt held on to something real without flinching, through the months of uncertainty and the community's cold shoulder and Eleanor's considerable capacity for resistance, and held on not because he was certain of the outcome, but because he was certain it was worth trying for. On a Saturday evening in early May, nearly a full year after the gate hinge conversation that had started all of it, the three of them sat on the porch after supper. Gideon had his boots up on the rail. Eleanor was mending something, which she did in the evenings now because she'd admitted, once, briefly, that she slept better when she'd done something with her hands before bed. Colt was doing nothing in particular, which he was getting better at. The mountains were going gold in the last light. Not a metaphor, just the specific thing that happens to Montana mountains at the end of a clear spring day when the angle of the light catches the remaining snow on the high faces and turns it a color that has no practical name. "The south pasture needs rotating next week," Eleanor said, not looking up from her mending. "I know," Gideon said. "The Hadley boy asked if we had work this summer," Colt said. "He's 16 and big enough to be useful. Talk to him Monday," Eleanor said. The porch held its silence. The light moved off the mountains. It was enough. It was, in the most honest accounting, more than enough, which is not the same as perfect, has never been the same as perfect, and is in fact considerably better because perfect is a thing you maintain at distance, and this was a thing they were all inside of, scars and habits and difficult mornings and all. The frontier doesn't care about your story. It never did. It just keeps going, season after season, indifferent and enormous, asking the same question it always asks. What are you made of, and will it hold? They had answered that question, not once in some decisive moment, but over and over again in all the small moments that make a life. And taken axes and fixed fence posts and honest conversations in cold barns and hands held in April mud and a green dress in a September field and a porch light left on so nobody had to come home to the dark. That's what it was. That's what it is. That's how it held.